And my contribution today is exploring some of the theological resonances of the recent wave of climate activism in the last couple of years, and some of the models that it's taken, both implicitly and explicitly from the Christian tradition, and how these have been really generative, but also in some senses harmful. And my reflections are more specifically on climate activism rather than climate change or ecological theology more generally. So in the last couple of years, this climate activism has been my primary habitus, my community, my grounding, my purpose, my home. And it's that location that I'm speaking from today. Climate activism is home to me, but as many of you will know, not all homes are not without their complications and conflicts and lessons to be learned from past mistakes. So specifically, I'm going to be drawing on my experience with Extinction Rebellion, which probably most of you will have heard of now, which is a decentralised and non-hierarchical activist network. And I had a very intense 16 months as part of XR's, I was going to say XR rather than Extinction Rebellion every time, as part of XR Scotland around the year 2019. It's to say I'm not part of XR anymore. I still have a lot of love and respect for XR Scotland and for the groups around the country taking action week on week. And I have a lot of very good friends still who are still part of XR. It's not my path anymore. I'm not really going into my reasons for leaving in this talk. Some of them will be implicit, I think, rather than explicit. A lot of my theological work uses life writing, called autoethnography. So its idea is it's life writing, but the hope is that it's contributing to broader insights, but with things that are going to be interesting and helpful to other people and to scholarship more generally. But bringing in your own life stories, you have to really be really aware that firstly it's not a case of I felt it, therefore it's true, that my own experience doesn't have some intrinsic authority just because it happened to me. And also that personal experience isn't authoritative, but also these narratives that I'm creating based on memory, they're very much kind of mediated and constructed for a specific purpose. I'm going to be remembering something and taking it and shaping it. I suppose I'm very interested in craft, making it into a shape that for a particular purpose. This purpose is to maybe have insights from a broader perspective. I don't want it to be an extended confessional or therapy session, much as probably Rood House is a very tempting place to be doing that. It feels very safe to do that. But getting that balance between autoethnography and kind of more confessional writing or speaking, it's not an easy balance. I hope I got it right here. So to take us back to October 2018 and the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, published a report collating the findings of 130 scientists. It was called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade, and the 1.5 degrees refers to the treaty agreed in Paris 2015, the Paris Agreement, in which the nations of the world made a legally binding commitment to strive to limit the global heating caused by carbon emissions to just 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels. I think it's currently at about 1.2 degrees now. So this report was remarkable not so much because of its findings about the extent of human-induced climate change and the damaging impacts that have already seen in temperature rises, droughts, food shortages, hunger, and extreme weather throughout the globe. These have long been claimed not only by scientists, but by the people living at the sharp edge of climate change in the most affected areas of the global south. We use the term global south and global north throughout, so global north does include Australia and New Zealand to some extent when I'm talking in the more political sense. And global south does tend to refer to nations in South Asia and Africa and South America. So it's a lot like, I suppose, the kind of model of the West as well. But this is the one that tends to be used in these kind of climate change circles now. So indeed, the IPCC findings have also been claimed as being more conservative in their estimations than the science suggests. So instead, what was remarkable about this report was the departure from the normally measured language of the United Nations and the political implications of the statement that, quote, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And what was perhaps even more remarkable, and I think accounting much for this moment marking a sea change in discourse on and awareness of climate change, was how the mainstream media picked up on the finding that carbon dioxide would need to fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. And that figure became extrapolated by the press into a 12 years left deadline, with headlines such as, "We have 12 years left to limit climate change catastrophe. Planet has only until 2030 to stem catastrophic climate change. And we have 12 years to act on climate change before the world as we know it is lost." Earlier that year, 2018, sustainability leadership professor Jen Bendel self-published a paper titled Deep Adaptation, a Map for Navigating Climate Tragedy. That argued that climate science demonstrates the inevitability of societal collapse caused by global heating, with a near-term breakdown of civilization. Meanwhile, Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg was gaining notoriety for her striking from school to demand action on climate change, a solitary action that soon gathered momentum from weekly school strikes to the global Fridays of Future movement. And I'm sure Greta would be the first to say that people joining up with this network, Fridays for Future, included climate activists, young climate activists from the global south who have been taking action for a long time before her. She's very much become the poster girl, and her whiteness may be a lot to do with that, but there are many others, maybe activists of colour and indigenous activists that have been fighting this fight. So on the 31st of October, Extinction Rebellion launched with a declaration of rebellion at the Houses of Parliament in Westminster. And me up in Scotland, reading in The Guardian about this event, with its speeches from Greta herself and the likes of George Monbiot and Rowan Williams, friend of Holy Rood House, I was inspired by its name, Extinction Rebellion, with mass species extinctions being a main focus of the climate anxiety and ecological grief that have been creeping up on me over several years, and the anger and the resistance, the rage, contained in the word rebellion. I wanted to let myself be furious. I wanted to stand in the street and declare, no, we will not put up with this anymore. This global system is wrong and it is killing us. I was not alone. 2 weeks later, thousands were motivated to join XR in mass non-violent protests, blocking traffic on 5 major bridges in the centre of London, citing the examples of the civil rights movement, the suffragettes and Gandhi in using civil disobedience as a moral obligation in the face of government's failure to protect life. And there are 3 demands to the government. 1, tell the truth about the climate and ecological emergency. 2, act now, reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025. And 3, create a citizens' assembly to oversee the changes. And at the same time, I was among those getting Extinction Rebellion Scotland up and running north of the border, with our own declaration and set of demands to the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood. So both the nascent movements, Extinction Rebellion and the youth strikes, were given impetus by the IPCC report, and they picked up on the 12 years left deadline, but they amped up the rhetoric even further with "this is an emergency" and "our house is on fire." And at the time, longer-term climate activists commented to me that XR seemed to be ripping up the rulebook of climate change and sustainability communication. So for years, NGOs and campaigners have been told that highlighting the increasingly catastrophic effects would make people feel scared and despairing, rather than inspired to take action. And they said that it was better, they had thought, to give people these breadcrumbs of hope. I think maybe breadcrumbs of optimism rather than hope, such as 10 actions you can take at home to be more sustainable. Turn down your heating, eat less meat, walk to the shop rather than drive, etc. But all the while knowing that this is pretty much meaningless when we're locked into a global economic system that depends on ever-increasing consumption, driven by fossil fuels, sold by corporations determined to keep us addicted to them for as long as possible. So, even in those early days of XR, there was the argument that they were taking it too far, with actions like this banner on the bridge there saying with climate change we're fucked, and that not being actually that different from Private Fraser and Dad's Army saying we're doomed. And critiques of the climate doomist approach included the climate scientist Michael Mann and the writer and spiritual activist Alistair McIntosh in his book Riders on the Storm. So my position on doomism, which Alistair McIntosh more kindly renders as alarmism, at the time, as I was becoming even though I had a part-time job as a lecturer and as an editorial assistant, I also pretty much was more than full-time with the National XR Scotland group and my local XR Glasgow group. But I felt that this apocalyptic rhetoric of climate emergency was really powerful in getting across the vast scale of the issue and the necessary responses to it. In fact, I really thought about Extinction Rebellion as having a prophetic role of speaking truth to power and to the people, as represented in XR's first demand to tell the truth, of shaking up the present ordering of the world, or business as usual, of presenting a vision of possible transformation while condemning in the strongest possible terms what it is that is so dreadfully, terribly, overwhelmingly wrong with the current economic and political system, voicing that with love and rage as we then signed off our emails. And I saw the extreme public performance prophesying of Ezekiel and the symbolic visions of Amos in XR's artistic performances and installations, and also in non-violent direct action, the ritualised blocking of roads, the occupation of the public square, the prefigurative action of occupying Scottish Parliament to stage a citizens' assembly, which I was part of in January 2019. Prefigurative is a term often used in anarchist political circles as being about creating the world that you want to see in the present world. So it is, yes, very prophetic as well. And so my thinking here about this prophetic role of XR, it was influenced by my background in feminist theology and the interdisciplinary field of literature and theology, in the importance of the social imaginary, in how the symbolic models that we think with, about how these models, our imagination, are so crucial to action, but also how important it is to allow for several imageries and metaphors in any theological system. And I remember John Dominic Crossan on the mythic and parabolic aspects of story, and how the role of parables is to break open, and Rosemary Radford-Ruth's characterisation of the sacred canopy and prophetic modes of religion, there being these two modes, and the task of the latter being to denounce the former, and Sally McFade's notion of the sacramental or more priestly role in theological language models, as contrasting with the pole based on metaphors or the prophetic, powered by this tension between the is and the ought. We see how the world is, we know how it wants to be, and this tension is what gives you the energy. And the priestly and prophetic modes are both necessary. They're both always needed to go together. And I saw the former in XR's regenerative culture principle, alongside the more prophetic-oriented and headline-grabbing civil disobedience. So this is something that maybe most people won't have known about Extinction Rebellion, that as well as being like we're going to block roads and cause trouble to get attention, and we're sounding an emergency, one of the kind of 10 key principles is that we need a regenerative culture, I guess playing on the idea of regenerative agriculture, in order to avoid activists burning out, and to have that we need to be acting in a way that's not just reproducing the unhealthy society that we live in, that we need to take care of each other and ourselves. And so that's where well-being during actions is always very high on the agenda, and there was, including a lot of, spirituality really as being an intimate part of the organisation, which for me, coming from a theological background and a spiritual background, I found quite welcoming. So that's regenerative culture. But overall, I regarded Exile's part in the contemporary climate and wider social justice movements to be prophetic, to sound the alarm that would cause the disturbance needed. And the apocalyptic is a significant aspect of the prophetic tradition. And if we consider apocalypse in a bit more theological depth than the kind of basic pop culture, the end of the world is nigh sense usually meant when referring to climate apocalypse, we uncover how it may be fruitful, but also harmful for today's climate movement. So, in a 1996 book, Apocalypse Now and Then, Catherine Keller, so she traces an apocalypse pattern throughout the history of culture, dominated by Christianity, and starting with the revelation of John of Patmos, the book of Revelation. And I'm interested in thinking about how recent climate activist discourse reinscribes this apocalypse pattern. So for Keller, the apocalypse pattern consists of these dualist, either-or, good-evil binaries, as well as the linear, time-based expectation of cataclysmic showdown in which good has the ultimate victory. And so in this sense, actually, a lot of the climate dualism of people like Jen Bengal is not truly apocalyptic, it's actually much more pessimistic than that. It's not saying there's going to be a showdown with good out, it's saying it's all going to end. And although it has often long been the case, in some of your more anti-civilization, also called primitivist aspects of the Green Movement, does rest on an imaginary of better ways of living emerging from the ashes of ecological and social catastrophe, this kind of apocalyptic viewpoint wasn't one I ever came across in XR. Instead, we were focused on preventing such collapse with the temporally oriented frame perpetuated by the United Nations, the world's government, and the global economic system, that of reducing carbon dioxide emissions to a certain level by a certain date. And in the case of XR in the UK, to net zero by 2025, the Act Now, which was the second of XR's 3 demands. So in the first half of 2019, I had some conversation and correspondence with Alistair McIntosh about his concerns about the 2025 demand, which he later set out more in the Riders of the Storm book, that such an extreme departure from the present fossil fuel-based economy could never be achieved without authoritarianism. My response at the time kind of parroted the official XR line that the third demand for citizens' assemblies with legally binding sovereignty would guard against any threat of eco-fascism. I also felt that Extinction Rebellion Scotland, our demands were a lot more specific, and so we said, I think still do say, by 2025 change the economy to one rather than being based on accelerating consumption to one based on ensuring the well-being of all, and I felt that well-being of all aspect would protect against that. Today I have a little bit more understanding of the world of carbon offsetting, of imagined future technologies of carbon sequestering and of renewable energy technology. And I now also know that net zero is a cynical fiction, actually, that net zero. Because what it means is you can pollute a lot, but then if you're also offsetting it somewhere else, then it all works out. So often what's happening in the global north is that we're basically being like, well, okay, well, we planted a load of trees and this is somebody else's land somewhere in Africa, so therefore we offset the carbon emissions we've made by flying our executives to this conference or whatever. And it's really aimed to extend business as usual in the global north with continued exploitation of the global south. But I recall a fellow Exile Scotland activist, Justin Kenrick, who's also an anthropologist and Quaker and a very wise man, and he said for him the fact that the 2025 figure was impossible within the current system made it a demand to completely transform the system. In this sense, then, 2025 is more of a symbol than a literal target. But the trouble with any symbol is that it does need to be clear that that is what it is. And this can be difficult, firstly because the symbol is so intimately connected with that which it symbolises, and indeed is even present in it, thinking of Eucharistic theology, even without fully expressing its reality. And secondly, and has been expounded by feminist theologians, symbols and metaphors so often become literalised and then solidified or indeed dead. And in the words of Marshall Falk, reflecting the feminist prophetic task of denouncing the dead metaphors of God as Father or Lord, dead metaphors make strong idols. Dumb as stone, they stand stubbornly in the way, like boulders jutting up in the desert. They block our view of any oasis that may lie ahead. And one such idolatrous symbol relating to the sense of a deadline for limiting carbon emissions, be it Exiles 2025, the 2030 extrapolated from the IPCC report, or the UK government's woefully inadequate 2050, is that of the clock. So just this month, you can see in your picture, a climate clock has been projected onto the Tollbooth Steeple clock tower in Glasgow, my home city and the host of the United Nations COP26 climate talks. And in some ways the site is really apt. It's a historic plaza where public proclamations were read out. The Merchant City Quarter displays the 19th century wealth of the second city of the empire that Glasgow was, generated by colonialism and the slave trade, which are a really central element of the climate crisis. The climate crisis, in many ways began with the colonial expansion of the New World, rather than, say, the Industrial Revolution, or one couldn't have happened without the other. But I hate it. What I see referred to on Twitter as the Glasgow Climate Doomsday Clock has two faces. One, a deadline, which counts down to the date by which global temperatures must be limited to 1.5 degrees C to stop irreversible climate change. The second, a lifeline, totting up the percentage of the world's energy generated by renewable resources. And it makes me angry, not just because of the problems from a climate justice perspective of touting renewable energy technology as an unadulterated good, when it does largely depend on, it uses minerals that have to be extracted from places around the world, particularly the global south, say Chile and so on, which is actually kind of neo-colonialism, I would say, and it's ecologically harmful, even if it might feel like it's doing good from a climate perspective. From the ecological catastrophe perspective, it's not necessarily any better. But what bothers me really is this symbol, the clock itself. Clocks symbolise what has been diagnosed as modernity's unhealthy and unjust concept of time. Time has become a resource to be consumed, a limited resource that we're perpetually running out of in a hyper-sped-up world in which time is also that which consumes us. And the Western concept of linear time has been accused as the culprit, what with the Christian apocalyptic concept of history as travelling towards an inevitable end point, so the paradigm goes, and that's exacerbated by the Enlightenment, which in some ways, is a very problematic time for our thinking, and distorted by the capitalist economics. So Catherine Keller draws on historical analysis which traces the invention of the mechanical clock to the Benedictine monastic call to prayer throughout the day, and John Swinton has done this as well in his book Becoming Prince of Time. And Neil Postman wrote in his book Technopoly, what the monks did not foresee was that the clock is a means not merely of keeping track of hours, but also of synchronising and controlling the actions of men. And thus, by the middle of the 14th century, the clock had moved outside the walls of the monastery and brought a new and precise regularity to the life of the workman and the merchant. Without the clock, capitalism would have been quite impossible. And similarly for Keller, the role of Christianity in the development of modern Western bondage to the clock is actually quite direct. For her, the clock is symbolic of the progression of the modern state's capacity to regulise the spirits and labour of its citizens, to keep them in place by controlling their time. And she notes the collusion of Christianity and capitalism in the colonial project, quoting native First Nations American scholar Paula Allen Gunn. Chronological time, the idea that everything has a starting point and an ending point, reflects accurately the process by which industry produces goods. There is a connection between factories and clocks, and there is a connection between colonial imperialism and factories. And Keller relates the feverish pace of Greenwich Meridian time to the Christian eschatological narrative, in which this universal condition of finitude, I don't know whether to say a finitude or finitude. I'm going to go with finitude actually, sounds like finitude becomes the high-pitched eschatology that our civilization canonized. In Apocalypse, we must all face finitude together, all at once. And crucial to Keller's critique is how Christian obsession with the end of days fed into colonialism and industrial capitalism, and this has led to the situation that we are now in, facing the end of the world as we know it, an ecological catastrophe. So in the famous words of Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and that's why I hate this Glasgow climate clock. It's clocks that got us here. And no clock, no deadline, no technologies made in factories where people enslaved to labour for low wages, making things out of materials extracted from indigenous people's land to power the lifestyles of the rich is going to get us out of it. And to quote the indigenous and people of colour-led collective Wretched of the Earth, named after Frantz Fanon's generative work on colonialism, in their speech at the London Climate Strike on September 20th, 2019, a climate-just world cannot and will not repeat the same things that got us here in the first place. So the Glasgow climate clock, for me, represents the cruel optimism, to use a term by Lauren Ballon in a great book called Cruel Optimism, in which that which you hope for or want or are working towards is actually that which is stopping your flourishing. So this cruel optimism that Tommy Lynch describes as the right combination of policy and technology will mean that we can maintain our world just with less pollution, emissions and waste, and that confronting climate change will push humanity to reconsider its relationship with other than human nature and enter a new period of ecologically responsible civilization. So that's how he's passing this attitude that we can work it out with technology, we can fix this problem. But such a continuation of modernity's grand narrative of history as progress dissolves in the face of the realities of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene being this new geological age that we're now in which the Earth has been, in some ways, irrevocably changed by humanity, or I think by some aspects of humanity, not all humanity. So, as Lynch argues, echoing the claims of the climate justice movement led by Indigenous and Global South activists, such approaches take climate change to be the central issue rather than symptom of a deeper problem, as a technological issue rather than an ethical and political one. Or maybe so they take this as the illness rather than the symptom of the illness, and they're just trying to fix it with plasters rather than looking at the deeper source, the need of healing. So I talked about, I quoted Keller talking about apocalypse as being something that we face the end, that we always have an end but at different times as creatures who die. But with this idea of apocalypse, we're facing it all together all at once. But with climate apocalypse, we are not facing it all together all at once. And to use Tommy Lynch's phrases, the world as we know it is the problem. It is a fundamentally fallen, wrong world that would be better to end. So in the sense that the political, social, economic world, the constructed human world that we have is the world that needs to end. And the meaning of the word apocalypse, as Keller explores in this year's Facing Apocalypse, is not disaster or catastrophe or doom. It means unveiling, uncovering, revealing. And this theological image came into a recent statement of the COP26 UK Civil Society Coalition of activists and NGOs. NGO meaning non-governmental organisation charities. So the word apocalypse comes from the word for revelation. The climate crisis, much like the COVID pandemic, is revealing what many have long known, that the luxuries of the few depend on the suffering of the many. And what the climate and ecological crisis shows to those privileged who are not already all too aware can be cast in a different temporal frame than the 12 or 5 years or whatever the latest carbon emissions deadline is. Wretched of the Earth, ripping on Greta Thunberg and XR, powerfully declared, "You have all heard that our house is on fire, but for many of us, our house has been on fire for 500 years." In another symbolic installation on climate change at Merchant City at the Tollbooth Cross, we did it first, also temporarily framed back in July 2019. XR Glasgow, we blocked the road with a 25-foot purple boat. The sail bore the words, "Act Now," and on the other side of the boat it said, "Act Now," and the slogan, "The future you fear is already here." We wanted to draw attention to what was already happening around the world, the boat symbolising climate refugees in particular. The act now, not despite of, but because of, the too late. So the world that Tommy Lynch argues we should hope for the end of is explained thus in the Wretched of the Earth speech. We were thrust here by powerful forces that drove the unequal distribution of resources and the rigged structure of our societies. The economic system that dominates us was brought about by colonial projects whose sole purpose is the pursuit of domination and profit. For centuries, racism, sexism and classism have been necessary for the system to be upheld. And then also the COP26 coalition statement. But all these crises we face also reveal the possibility that the world can change. It doesn't have to be this way. We don't want to save the world. We want a new one. And in the oft-quoted, even to the point of cliche, phrase by Arundhati Roy, "Another world is possible. She is on her way. And on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And this brings me back to Keller's apocalypse pattern, and it's another element of that I do feel more ambivalent about. I do timepieces and deadlines in climate discourse. An apocalypse pattern which consists of these dualist good and evil binaries, as well as the expectation of cataclysmic showdown in which good has the ultimate victory. And I do see this in the language of my climate justice comrades, and I use it a lot myself in the kind of work I'm doing now. And I do have this at the back of my mind. I'm repeating this apocalypse pattern. So Keller notes that the apocalypse pattern, always adjacent to suffering, rests upon an either-or morality, a proclivity to identify with the good and purge the evil from oneself and one's world once and for all, and to feel that the good is getting victimised by the evil, which is diabolically overpowering. And that's often enacted by even the most progressive of political movements, I think including those that I'm part of now. And this pattern, that Keller argues, is neither good nor evil, rather it is a habit destructive, and perhaps first of all self-destructive. And so the second main aim of the book, Apocalypse Now and Then, is to seek healing from this habit through resistance to either-or logic, and to point towards counter-apocalyptic ways of sustaining resistance to destruction without expecting to triumph. And this involves a spirituality that might compete with apocalyptic fundamentalisms on behalf of a sustainable and shared life in the present. What I'm going to turn to now is an unhealthily self-destructive iteration of this apocalypse pattern, as identified by Keller above in the recent climate movement, and how these come to intersect with my main theological keyword, which is sacrifice. So it's me sitting on the road in April 2019. So with some discomfort, I read back my words in an email to Alistair McIntosh in April 2019, in the weeks following my participation in a mass protests in Edinburgh and central London that really made Extinction Rebellion a household name, and it arguably led to the Scottish and the UK governments declaring climate emergency. So I was writing in response to Alistair's hitherto mentioned concerns with the dangers of the 2025 demand. And I said to him, I fear you're right that it's not possible to make the changes needed to avert the worst of the catastrophe without some form of authoritarian environmental policy. But for me, this is preferable to the alternative and preferable to the toxic market-worshipping neoliberalism we have now. And what causes my discomfort reading this back is not so much my rather dualist, either-or, apocalypse pattern sense of this toxic market-worshipping neoliberalism, or that it's in no way to be preferred to any eco-authoritarian dystopias. Although I emphatically do not want any green dictatorships, I also believe that the world as it is now is in no way free. It's not even safe for the majority of people, even if those of us living in social locations of privilege may live with the convincing illusion of freedom and safety. But what discomforts me reading back this email was this time at which I was really exhausted, and I was low-level traumatised, and I would go on to exhaust and traumatise myself continuously for another 6-7 months before burning out, before activist burnout came on me. And I use these words to avert the worst of the catastrophe, and that really summed up for me that I was kind of living with this, my activism being driven by these two facets of the eschatologically charged, Christianity-inflected, lay capitalist concepts of time. So there I am again with my knitted jumper, as I was knitting involved, and this picture really sums up 2019 for me, actually, with a load of activists and banners concentrating on my computer, kind of doing something, organising. Yeah, that was at the Rood rebel camp of that there. So in June 2019. So this first aspect of those facets are that time was running out to avert catastrophe, to save the suffering victims, this duty of the privileged inheritors of colonialism in the global north, anxious for our own future, but not already living with the very worst consequences. And second, that I was obliged to use as much of my time and my skills as possible in being productive for the cause, that I was only worth to the movement what I was able to do for it. And with that first, I was reenacting the patterns of my childhood and teenage background in charismatic evangelicalism, and that very real belief that I had as a teenager in eternal damnation to hell for all non-believers, and that one only had a certain amount of time to save people from. And the second, the sense of time running out and this need to be doing things to be productive, I was also rehearsing the steps of my experience of trying to make a career in academia in these constant part-time and temporary posts. And I saw, and I still see today, these patterns being drawn again and again by others like me in the climate movement. And whether it's the wing that I'm pretty more involved in now, who chant one solution, revolution, or those who focused instead on net zero by 20 whatever. Whatever we think, whether we think there is X amount of years left, or that the fundamental catastrophe is 5 centuries old, much of the movement is stuck in a conception of the climate and ecological crisis as a problem that needs fixing, as something that needs a solution, rather than wounds and disconnections, damaged relationships in need of healing. And in the mindset of whiteness and neoliberalism, that it is down to us as individuals to solve ourselves. And so we run on a constant treadmill of coordinating, campaigning, marching, organising, scrolling, social media posting, flyering, giving talks, mazes of Google Docs, and endless meetings. I was so zoomed out before the pandemic, so keeping going because it is so important. And there's a major global summit coming, and there's this parliamentary debate happening, and we have to do it now, no matter how worn out we are. And really this is just an exclusionary a model for activism for disabled, racialised, working class and other marginalised folk, as XR strategy of mass arrests or of people deliberately getting arrested to clog up the police cells. which is something you may have read, criticism of that from more kind of left-wing end. So I remember a friend saying to me about an intense and high-risk direct action that didn't work out as planned, but it took a huge amount of resources, stress and danger to all people involved. I thankfully wasn't one of them. She had asked me earlier, we're doing this thing, do you want to know? And I was, by that point, burnt out, and I said, no, I don't want to know, and I'm so bad. Anyway, but she said to me, even though we're all a mess right now, even though we've all fucked up our lives, if we pulled it off, wouldn't it have been worth it? And at the point of hearing this, my answer was this emphatic no. However epic the action, it is never worth ruining lives for. And I had always felt that any model of activism as sacrifice could be damaging to the individual and collective health of the climate movement. So sacrifice was actually literally, using that word was talked about in some of Extinction Rebellion's kind of strategy and training documents, the idea that seeing people being arrested in public, people would witness a sacrifice and would be kind of moved from witnessing this to action. But as a feminist theologian, every time they said the word sacrifice, I went, I flinched. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, Hosea 6, verse 6, or Matthew 9, verse 13. And while there were more merciful self-compassion and collective care elements of our principles and organising structures, this was in constant tension with the sense of the importance and urgency of our mission, no matter the personal cost, and even because of the personal cost. So I'm in the bottom picture there, in the teal dress. And I'm now kind of speaking from that place. So, Easter weekend 2019. I am lying on my back on a road outside the Houses of Parliament, my outstretched left arm inside a metal tube reinforced with concrete. Attached to it by a chain around my wrist, a fellow activist locked on at the other end. We are with others similarly locked on, glued to the floor or to each other, or just sitting and determined to stay where they are. Beyond this circle, a louder crowd is forming, slow drumming keeping the beat of the singing, led by the Shakti Singh's women's choir, all dressed in red. Some of them are at the top there. And my friend, in a role of speaking with the police on behalf of the activists, says to the crowd, while gesturing gently with lifted hands, "The police will now make arrests. Please continue singing. Please continue to be calm. You're all doing an amazing job. I love you all." The somber-faced police officers, dressed in black and white, have finished dismantling our gazebo, and we can see the sky again. And I realise, though I've completely forgotten, it's Holy Saturday, but tomorrow will be Easter. For the last couple of days, my affinity group have been one of several trying to hold the exile blockades in Parliament Square. This April International Rebellion is a transformative and empowering experience for some, but I and others are finding it very stressful. We've been on constant high alert with police coming to make arrests and clear us out. Others returning having already been carried off and arrested. Others working as well-being support, finding it hard to watch this happening to people they care about. That morning I had felt the tension in my shoulders and my chest, and I realised how it was affecting my body, this fear of police presence. But for me this was temporary. I could go home from it. What this feeling must do to the bodies of those in communities that live with this all the time. But right at that moment, a glimpse of what I swear are wild geese flying overhead, I feel calm, knowing my place as an arrestable within this now familiar ritual of police ungluing, cutting out and carrying away limp-bodied activists to chanting, cheers and applause. But the mood is different now. The singing, the setting sun, and the unity of crowd and song together, a surprisingly joyful, not doomy, prophetic act of collective lament, and lots of people are weeping, including me. I feel at peace for perhaps the first time ever in London, and maybe more than I ever have. I hear a woman behind me saying to the police, "They're doing this for you." I have made my choice. This is what I had to do in this time and in this place. And even while I was being cut out, which takes nearly an hour, my mind reflects the real physical danger I was in. The sparks from the angle grinder against the night sky were like fireworks or shooting stars. So that I have edited a little. What follows is completely verbatim from something I presented at an activism and sociology event less than a week after the events described. I don't know what I was doing in the presentation. Within a week of being arrested twice. Anyway, 14 hours later in a police cell, when I realised I'd been there for 12 hours and I still hadn't seen a solicitor, that this was really happening. I was trapped here and I couldn't get out. I was no longer at peace. It was my second arrest that week and I was in crisis. The night before, surrounded with the love of comrades and strangers, I felt invincible. But in that cell, on my own, I thought, I can't cope with this. I don't have what it takes. Those of us that put ourselves in arrestable positions are lauded by the movement as heroes, as conscientious protectors, putting our bodies on the line. But in that crisis, the question that wouldn't leave me was, why are we doing this to ourselves? Several hours later, I'd been interviewed and released and made my way to the designated protest zone of Marble Arch, without my phone or my friends, because the site our lock-on held the night before was now being cleared, others going through what I'd had the previous evening, but in the heat of the afternoon sun. And when I look at pictures of it, they actually had both their arms locked on into tubes. I don't know why they did it that way, but so they, in some ways, couldn't get out even if they wanted to. A kind stranger asked me, "Do you think it's worth getting arrested?" And I replied, "Right now, I really don't know." Yesterday we held Exile Glasgow's first meeting since the start of the International Rebellion, and there are at least 40 new faces. For the last couple of weeks, the climate crisis has been in the mainstream news every single day because of what we did. Our non-violent direct action has inspired and empowered others to get involved, including those not in the privileged social locations that allow some of us to be arrestable. But my joy at these things is tainted, however, by the knowledge of the suffering that has resulted from this. The feminist theological world I work in critiques the notion of redemptive suffering and self-sacrifice in the Christian tradition, and I'm deeply uncomfortable to find Exile echoing this in the rationale for this mode of activism. I don't believe that movements should have martyrs, and I don't want to believe that any crisis requires that human beings become expendable, collateral damage. But I also fear that we have no other choice but to take these risks, although I think it's vital we become more critically careful in how we frame them. But on a more positive note, what will keep me here are the bonds that those of us who took part in the rebellion have formed with each other through collective decision-making and struggle, bonds of solidarity and love. I'm a feminist theologian, and although with some caveats, I do believe with Joanne Carlson Brown and Rebecca Parker that suffering is never redemptive and suffering can never be redeemed. And I've always balked, as I said, at Exile's use of the word sacrifice and their valorisation of it as a strategy. And in my time with Exile, I was a big advocate for not taking unnecessary risks and for making sure everyone was fully trained and understood the implications of their actions. But in some ways I didn't follow that advice myself that evening. And I ended up putting myself in these situations that did lead to some mild post-traumatic stress. I had flashbacks and things in the weeks following. And also this real guilt at how my privilege had protected me from the danger and harm that others do face in police custody. And also the experience of being cut out of a lock-on opened up all sorts of complicated memories and trigger points from my history of self-harm, which was itself tied into the kind of atonement theology I was raised with. And I knew that these were unhealthy patterns, but I kept enacting them. The Christ figure illusions of Exile's messaging and imagery made me cringe, but it was still compelling. And when I saw the church and I saw that I would be speaking from underneath a crucifix, I thought, oh no, I don't want to be speaking there. But then I thought maybe it's actually apt, because he will always be hanging over me in some way. So that night, that sense of kenosis, of self-emptying, of being in the centre of the circle, the purity of purpose in making yourself completely vulnerable before the mightier adversary of the police and their threat of violence, And these apocalyptic affects are powerful, and they can actually be really addictive. So the flip side of sacrifice is saviorism. It's making it all about you, taking selfless action to save the helpless other, whether that helpless other is the ecosystem or your future grandchildren or people in small island nations about to be drowned by the rising seas. And instead I advocated after that for a kind of an ideal of solidarity, not sacrifice. And that doesn't mean, I think, asking people what sort of action should we be taking in solidarity for you, rather than this. We're doing this on their behalf without actually acting with them. But what was so powerful about that evening in Parliament Square wasn't the arrests and the lock-ons, not individual acts of partly well-meaning, partly self-indulgent heroism. It was the collective power, the togetherness of hundreds of people, friends and strangers, all singing. But collectivity is complicated, and group solidarity, or at least one form of it, became part of the problem for me. I think of my words, what will keep me here are the bonds of solidarity and love. When a friend tags me in a post by a US racial justice activist, Leslie Mack, on Twitter, she says, we need to build trauma-informed organising structures, how trauma affects our connections with each other, even if the effects feel good right now. And I think what did keep me with XR long after it ceased to feel good is what Tada Kazumi calls activist trauma bonding and cultural codependency. I felt so close to these people because of what we'd been through together, and something that outsiders would never understand. And I needed the group, and I felt that they needed me, even though I'd worn myself out to a point where there wasn't much of me left anymore. And beneath this, the fear that they wouldn't love me anymore if I stopped. So maybe it took a global pandemic for me to break out of these patterns, to finally recognise the deeply prophetic truth of Tricia Hersey of the NAP Ministry, which I don't know if you've come across them, which is brilliant. She's on Instagram and Twitter, the NAP Ministry. Rest is resistance, and my worth is not my work. And as she would see, go take a goddamn nap. So instead, I'm trying to learn new patterns. My activism now is slow and juddering, with long breaks in between short bursts of activity. And I'm reminded of political theologian Karen Bray's call in her recent book, Grave Attending, for a bipolar temporality that refuses the cruel optimism and happy efficiency of neoliberalism and affirms collapsing into bed, embracing one's feelings of overwhelming exhaustion and accepting my porosity to the world, a state of sensitisation that means I can't cope with hardcore activism anymore, but I do choose to allow myself to be soft instead. And I need to take it slow because we are in this struggle for the rest of our lives, not until some future goal is reached, some specific victory won. And maybe we will see revolution or collective awakening or the great turning, as Joanna Macy calls it, or whatever your apocalyptic hope. But even then, collective liberation is a continuous practice. It is not an end point. And while the looming climate and ecological crisis may seem like a vindication of the linear, end-oriented, once and for all apocalyptic Christian view of history, we need not repeat that in our own lives and activism. So mine are familiar stories and patterns from activist movements since the 60s, and no doubt before, of burnout and conflict and trauma and privilege. And attempting to think in a more cyclical mode than the eschatological linearity of my heritage, I expect a lifetime of making and learning from and forgetting the similar mistakes, bearing witness to others doing the same, and hoping that we will retain some of the wisdom as we go. Walking, we ask questions, the maxim of indigenous Mexican revolutionaries, the Zapatistas. Walking, we ask questions, and that reminds me of Micah chapter 6, verse 8, a line from the prophets that has come to me at various points in my life and now represents what a healthy and prophetic climate activism might look like. What does your God require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? We need loving kindness, to be merciful to ourselves and to others, and that means plenty of rest. Go take a nap. And love may yet go with rage, and doing kindness does not mean letting go of an uncompromising demand for justice in all aspects of our lives and selves. And walking humbly, and I'm thinking of that that word humble and that intimate connection with the earth. But it also means being prepared to keep going, to acknowledge what we do not know, to ask questions and keep on questioning, to make mistakes and to forgive ourselves yet again. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. Facing apocalypse, listening for the breath of a new world as the whole creation labours, this is all we can do.